just to continue what we've been talking about, the MSU, we've seen about 16 reviews using RoB2, and some of the practices in applying RoB2 and reporting it is what we want to highlight for you guys today. So the issues we are seeing are in the RoB2 data file. So for the purposes of peer review, we ask all authors to send us their consensus signaling questions and judgments and support or rationale for judgments. And we are having a look at a selection of a few of the results being assessed just to see how people are getting on. So so we do look at the RoB2 data files, and we recommend that in peer review that is looked at. So we have seen some issues with that. And we're also seeing some issues in the presentation of RoB2 in the review. So I'm going to go through those things now. So in terms of the consensus agreements, I'm going to be talking mostly about the Excel file, and you can submit there's a Word template as well, but we find that the Excel file tool seems to be far superior to that, just because of the amount of information it stores really concisely. So one of the things we're noticing is that authors aren't specifying the specific result that they're assessing. So RoB2 is a results-based tool, and the bias is assessed for specific results. So what we want to see here is the actual result that's being assessed. This view is the input screen for the Excel tool. And where the arrow's pointing is where you'd expect to see the result. An easier way to look at it is in the table view in Excel. So you can swap between input and table views. And here it's really clear to see in this results column that the authors haven't put in the result that they're assessing. So if we don't know what result they're assessing, it's difficult as peer reviewers to see if the bias they've reported actually matches up. So what we'd like to see is a version like this, where you can see a result. Oops. You can see here that this column, the results column, is completely filled in, and you've got a numerical result there. So the RoB2 tool uses a series of signaling questions to obtain a judgment for bias for each domain. This is the input screen in Excel, and we are looking down here at the domain tabs. And in this view, we have a problem because the authors have completed their signaling questions, but they haven't provided a rationale or a support for those answers. And also, they've not given rationale or support for their risk of bias judgment overall at the domain level. So what we'd prefer to see is a version like this, where all of the reasons for the answers have been completed here. And if you double click in this window here, the reason for judgment will be automatically filled in. And we'll see that these two steps are really important for our later slides for completing the results level tables. So it's really important to put your support for judgments in and your support for each signaling question answer. So that's what we'd like to see, is everything filled in. If you look in the results view in Excel, it's easy to see if you've completed all of these or if your authors have completed all of these, because these columns here where it says a note for question 4.2 and 4.1 are completely empty. There's very little information in there, and what we'd expect to see is all of the answers provided. Or not answers, the support for the answers provided. RoB2 also gives us judgment for overall bias. Again, we've got the input screen here, and we're on the overall bias tab. So in this sheet, you can see that no reason for the overall bias has been given. What we'd prefer to see is the reason for the judgment provided. So again, if you double click in that window, this in the Excel tool will auto-populate it with all of the reasons from each of the individual domains. So the overall domain will be a summation, if you like, of all of the information for the individual domains. But as you can see, this is quite a lot of text. So authors can edit that text down to a short summary of their reason for that overall bias, which in this case is some concerns. And you can see that looking at the bias assessments here, that there were issues with the randomization process and selection of reported results. So the authors have summarized those two items in this tab. And that's now ready to enter into RevManWeb. So one thing we'd like to talk about is how the actual bias is being assessed and how signalling questions are being answered. Again, this is in the full consensus agreement document that will accompany your review when you send it in for peer review. We often see issues at the domain level where authors have not considered all aspects of the domain, perhaps by answering only one or two of the signalling questions and not all of them, or perhaps not misreading what the questions are asking or not considering the guidance. Now, RoB 2 has been a learning curve for all of us. It's been a learning curve for us in the MSU. It will be for editors. And we just want to say that the MSU is here to support you as editors and as authors. So please do get in touch if you've got any early questions. Use those web clinics and ask us for any support that we can give you. We've all made these mistakes. I can say that I've made these mistakes too. And so in the domain judgments or the overall judgments, we've found that authors are perhaps not using the algorithm or following the algorithm, and it's good to check that during the peer review stage. It's okay for authors to disagree with the algorithm. The algorithm proposes a risk of bias judgment, but if you do disagree with it and want to put something else, it's really good you really need to say what the reason for that is. So I'm going to go through domain 1 and briefly through the other domains. So we often see domain 1 rated as high risk of bias, with the reason stated that there's baseline imbalance with one prognostic variable, for example. But having baseline imbalance for one prognostic variable isn't usually a reason for thinking that there's bias in the randomization process. So if we look at the signaling questions, there are 3. Was the sequence random? Was it concealed? And the third question is about baseline imbalance. And we think that authors are often spotting that there's baseline imbalance, looking at table 1 in their trial, and assuming that this means that there's high risk of bias. But baseline imbalance on its own isn't a problem and will quite often happen by chance in trials, especially small ones. And the signaling question isn't, was there baseline imbalance? But is there baseline imbalance that suggests a problem with the randomization? So while many trials will show baseline imbalance, because it can occur by chance, it doesn't mean that the trial is at high risk of bias. So we need to take care in answering these signaling questions and answer all of the questions and use the algorithm to get to the judgment support. So quite often we'll see when we go and look at these trials, if we're looking at someone's peer review and we have a little bit more of an in-depth look, when we see something like this, we'll find that there's no issue with the randomization or allocation. So when we look at the algorithm, I'll go through this really quickly. We can see that if there are no problems with randomization and allocation is concealed, baseline imbalance that occurs by chance will lead to low risk of bias. If it really does look like there's an issue with randomization, it will lead to some concerns. It's only when allocation isn't concealed and that baseline imbalances are suggesting a problem that it will lead to high risk of bias. So for domain 2, I should just say that there are individual webinars on each of the domains if you want more detail about how to answer and how to look at risk of bias. So for domain 2, we often see simple assessments based on the presence or absence of blinding, without considering the main aspect of this domain, which is deviations from interventions. The authors need to go through the signalling questions, answer them, and use the answers will inform the algorithm to get to their rationale. So if you only think about blinding, then you'll be ignoring one of the main aspects of this domain, which is deviations from interventions. So there are 7 signalling questions for domain 2, and only 2 of those are about blinding. And as I said, it's really important to go through each of them and use the answers for each of them within the algorithm to get to your support for judgment. So what we'd like to see is a support for judgment that is answering each of the parts of the signalling questions, addressing each of those aspects of deviations from interventions. Similarly, in domain 3, we're finding that people aren't answering all of the signalling questions and not using the algorithm for their bias judgment. So in this case, 80% of participants were lost to follow-up, but authors conclude because they were lost equally from each arm that risk of bias is low. Instead of this answer, we'd like authors to provide an answer again to the responses for all of the signalling questions, which ask us to say how much missing data is there, did the trialists assess the effect of missing data, and could missingness depend on its true value, and do you as reviewers think that missingness depended on its true value? So guidance on answering the signalling questions is available, and answers to these will inform the algorithm. And in this case, the judgment is some concerns rather than low. So again, the support for judgment is covering information from those signalling questions, key information from the signalling questions. For domain 4, again, because this domain does talk about blinding, we often see this as rated of high risk of bias because the outcome assessors weren't blinded. And again, we think that authors aren't going through all of the signalling questions, and the judgment doesn't reflect the bias in the trial associated with the result. So blinding is just one aspect for this domain, which is on outcome measurement. So we're asked to talk about, was the method of measuring the outcome inappropriate? Were the outcome measurements similar between groups? Were the outcome assessors blinded, and could the assessment be affected by knowing the assignment? And do you as reviewers think that it's likely? If authors answer all the questions and feed this into the algorithm, it will propose a judgment for bias. And in this case, the judgment is some concerns. The answer should be summarized to provide the rationale, as has been done here, where the measurement was appropriate and similar between groups. There is no information on blinding, and lack of blinding could affect the result, leading to a judgment of some concerns. So we're at the last domain now, where we're asked to look, we are often seeing authors stating that there's no statistical analysis plan and judging this to be at higher risk of bias or to have some concerns. So we think this might be to do with how this domain is worded. So authors can assess published protocols or trial registers and look at the lists of planned outcomes and time points. So it's important, so it doesn't have to be a statistical analysis plan. The availability of statistical analysis plans from trials is not that common, and ideally, yes, we would like to see them, but very often they're not available. So a protocol or a trial registry document is fine. We'd like you to check the date of the trial registry document or the protocol to ensure that it was made available before the trial was analysed. But in addition to that, even in the absence of a protocol, sometimes authors may use their clinical judgment if the outcome and time point is exactly as you'd expect and standard for a particular interventional outcome. So again, please see the guidance and specific webinars for more details about each of the domains, and do get in touch with us if you're confused about any of it. I know I've whistle-stopped through the 5 domains here, just highlighting those things that we're seeing most commonly. But really, the issue comes down to authors not answering all of the signalling questions and providing a reason for those, and perhaps not using the algorithm to arrive at their judgment of bias. So the algorithm will propose a judgment of bias, and it's fine for authors to disagree with the algorithm, but in the vast majority of cases, we're finding that it's really, you know, we would expect authors to agree with the algorithm. So, but if you don't, it's really important to propose a reason for that, and say why you disagree with it. And this is where you would check. So you look at these 2 columns in the Excel and just see whether the algorithm result matches the assessor's judgment. Very quickly, in terms of presenting the review in presenting RoB2 within your review, we'd like to see the results level tables to be completed fully. So we'd want every cell of the table to be filled in. And I think in RevMan Web now, there's some validation errors that will pop up if you haven't done this. So this one is correctly completed. You've got a judgment for each result. You've got a reason for judgment for each result. You've got a judgment for the overall and a reason for judgment for overall. So that's brilliant. This is the view of it that you would see in Archie or in RevMan Web. When it's published, this is what it will look like, as Kerry showed earlier, the interactive table. So you can see that if there were empty cells here, the interactive table wouldn't really be working for readers, which is why we want something filled in for every box. And this is just an example with some empty cells. So that's not where we would like to see all of those filled in. And this is the place in RevMan Web where you would be completing those pieces of information in the RoB2 section. In terms of text, the main error we're seeing in the review is that the results in the general risk of bias section, where authors continue to talk about risk of bias at the study level. So here's an example where authors are discussing bias in terms of how many studies were at specific risk of bias. Now, RoB2 is applied at the results level and needs to be discussed at the outcome level. This is an example from the published review that Kerry showed earlier. And there are good examples available in the published reviews of what we like to see, but that's the main thing that we're seeing that isn't quite right, and that the authors need to be talking about the bias at the outcome level. Just to finish, there's a list of our common errors. We are also drawing up a document to share with editors, and we'll do that with feedback from editors to make it a document that really works. We're all learning here, and so it's important that we work with each other to develop materials to support implementation of RoB2 in Cochrane reviews. Finally, I'd just like to say that we do have a web clinic every month. You can email us or with questions. The details are on this website. I'm sure Ella will post a link to it in the chat. And that's the end of my presentation. So I'll hand back over to Ella.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Tess. I think that's been really useful to see those common errors and to go through what we're hoping and expecting to see. We've only got about a minute left before we finish. We've probably got time for one question. So there's one here from Ruth who has asked, do you see any issues in reporting of outcomes that have not been assessed using RoB2 because not pre-selected for that? And any suggestions for good practice in reporting findings?
So authors can, if authors have applied RoB2 to an outcome that they haven't pre-specified, I think that's fine. They just need to say in their differences between a protocol and a review that this is what they've done. We haven't really seen many issues with that so far.
Great. And one from Emma, just one final question before we finish, if we could do this quickly. Do you think that authors are not answering the signalling questions because they don't understand issues around risk of bias and how that may or may not affect the results, or are they rushing through?
That's a good question. I don't know. We'd need you, the authors, to tell us that. I think there might be a bit of, like, when I'll talk from my own experience as an author. When I first went to use it, I made a lot of assumptions that things were the same as RoB1, and I did a lot of the very quick things I used to do with RoB1, especially around blinding. It just seemed to me that maybe the domains had been given different names, and it took me a while to really understand that it's very different. And I think that we are under a lot of time pressure, and there is a bit of a learning curve with RoB2. And I'd really suggest that the webinars in this series that go through each domain, they're all split up into really bite-sized little chunks, and they're really good, and they really help you understand why you need to think about things the way you're thinking. And I think this is because between RoB1 and RoB2, there's been a lot of years, and the science around bias has changed a bit. And I think that information is sort of really is sort of stuck in the methodologists and hasn't gone out to all the people, you know, like me, like authors out there. So, and those webinars on each domain are really useful in terms of explaining bias and how it's changed since RoB1. Really helpful in terms of using the RoB2 tool.